I think we have a few minutes for questions for both Diana and Celia. So we will likely take questions from each of the sites as well as the internet. Lori, would you like to go first in Edmonton?
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, so if anyone has a question for either of the speakers, just please come to the mic. And I think there's just one mic, so it is over here. And introduce yourself. And then people in other areas, Calgary, and on the web, please submit your questions to Catherine Lennon is working on them on the internet piece. And of course, Jackie will facilitate it in Calgary. So it looks like there's a question coming. So, okay, go ahead, ask your question.
My name is Butch Nutter. I'm a registered social worker. The presentations tend to be looking at prevention, and it seems to me that it would be better to phrase things in terms of promotion, because the absence of poverty is a good goal, but I would say that a better goal is to have everybody living decently, and that it to me puts a much different spin on things, because we're not talking about the bad things that we got rid of, but we're going toward what we really want.
Okay, positive focus. Diana, would you like to comment?
Sure. I think I think that there's lots of ways that we could turn the goals that we have into positive statements of aspiration. And I think it is really good to vision aspirational goals for a society where everyone benefits from the economic growth, where a society where all children have opportunities. And so I think each of the goals that have been talked about today can be turned into a statement of aspiration for the kind of society we want to live in. And it is always useful to do a visioning exercise where we vision that society and then talk about how to get there. And certainly our government needs to be looking more towards talking about goals, not outcomes in terms of, bums in seats or the number of people attached to a healthcare clinic, but more about the kind of healthy society we want to live in, or the kind of educated society we want to be in. And so I think it is useful for us to focus more on positive visions, really clear visions of the kind of society we should be having.
Thank you, Diana. And I think I'll turn it over to you in Calgary, Jackie.
Is there a question from any of our colleagues here in Calgary? There's a mic just on the side there.
Thank you, Diana. Marie Carlson in Calgary. I really enjoyed your presentation. I have a question that might sound theoretical. I'm interested in the way that you framed the approaches, you're calling it disparity approach. And some of the work we've done at Alberta Health Services is looking really carefully at terms like disparity, inequality, and equity. And very simply, in a nutshell, inequalities reflect differences between groups that may or may not be socially caused, height, eye color. And that term tends to be used synonymously with disparities, especially by U.S. audiences. And in a lot of the health literature, the term that is preferred is inequity, which is socially produced differences that are unfair, unjust, and modifiable through social policy. So I'm interested in your choice of terms and why it is you're using the term disparity. Thank you.
Is the mic on? There you go. One of the reasons that that we chose to talk about disparity is inequality has, and I think it's fantastic that the Occupy movement sort of sprang into people's consciousness as abruptly and strongly as it did. But inequality is often boxed into income and economic. And so disparity pushes a little further to look at well-being a bit more. And so inequality and inequity is previously would have been a broader definition, but just because inequality has become so much the framing that's used for economic inequality, I use disparity approach just to push a little further to talk about social and economic, and hoped that it would encompass a bit of a broader agenda.
Thank you, Diana. I just want to check to see if there's any questions that have come on from the web. Not yet. We do have another question here in Edmonton, so go ahead, please.
My name is Larry Boy. I'm board chair of Public Interest Alberta, and I want to congratulate the participants so far for the quality of the information and the insights that they put in front of us. And it seems to me, probably in this room, it's absolutely clear that, first of all, we can afford this, and we can afford it to the tune of $11 billion to $16 billion of tax room, but there's simply no doubt that it's affordable. And the second point that comes through equally clearly is it's in all of our interests to do so. In other words, it'll probably cost us less in the long run to make these kinds of equitable investments. So I regard the information as absolutely compelling. So then the question becomes, let's look at the decision makers, and in particular the MLAs, who will be making decisions about the investments or not on these programs. And to Diana, is it your impression that the MLAs understand about the tax room and they understand about what you will get for making these investments, but they just don't want to do that for reasons of a lack of a heart or the wrong values or any number of other explanations? Or is it that they actually don't get it and they're caught in another frame and we need to do a lot more work on changing their frame? I know we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves into next steps, but it seems to me it's very important to try to pin down why is it that they are not moving in this direction so that we can tailor our own efforts to nudging them along in a better direction?
That's a really good question, and a difficult one for me to answer politically. I waver. Some days I think it's a lack of understanding and that they've drank the Kool-Aid, being that the belief, the myths out there that, for example, that wealth trickles down. There's been clear data, even from TD Economics, that increased concentration of wealth is not leading to the kinds of job creation and GDP growth that they thought it would. Even in the United States, economists are coming out clearly and saying that they're building their assets, they're accumulating cash, they're buying back shares, but they are not investing in productive jobs in the economy today. They're speculatively investing in the markets. That money is not being used to create jobs. So the myth that if you raise taxes, we will lose jobs comes out of a myth that giving the money to the rich is better than giving it to the poor. And what you'd see in terms of spending is the rich are more likely to put it into debt payment or their condo in Hawaii, whereas lower income people are going to spend it on services in the local economy that create jobs and economic growth today. So the marginal propensity to spend that money is much higher if you put it in the hands of a low income person than if you put it in the hands of a high income person. So actually, if we want to see jobs and economic growth, we should be putting the money into the hands of lower income people, not wealthy people. And that data is clear. The same with corporations, not just because of foreign ownership, but because they are not investing that money in productive investment here in Canada. So some of it is that the right wing and purveyors of tax cuts have very successfully demonized taxes to the point where it is believed that if you touch taxes, the economy will just tank. And what we've seen in the data is the absolute opposite is true. I mean, if you look at Norway as a good example, and whenever I debate Scott Henning, all I do is I say, well, but Scott, Norway. Well, yeah, but Scott, Norway, he's from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Norway entered the recession later than Alberta, had a shallower dip, and left the recession sooner. Norway has a higher tax structure. It has a larger public sector. It has retirement security. It has universal publicly funded long-term care. What you see is that a larger public sector and investment in social programs actually reduces volatility in an economy and stabilizes it. So back to your question in terms of the politics, I would argue that some of them have bought the myths that are out there in the media about tax cuts, but they are false. I would also argue that some are acting in the interests of corporations and the wealthy. And for those, I would argue that it's self-serving, and you've seen in terms of the concentration of wealth, that in fact it's been very effective. If your interest is serving the wealthy and the corporations, the trickle-up economics has been very effective at ensuring they are wealthier today than they were 20 years ago. So for some, it's serving the interests of their friends in corporations and the wealthy. For others, it's misinformation perpetrated by corporate-owned media that is incorrect about taxes. Raising taxes can be good for the economy if we spend that money appropriately on social programs and put it in the hands of the right people. Thank you.
Thank you. Jackie, I'll pass it back to you and just wonder if there's any questions from Calgary.
Any other questions in Calgary at all? We have one coming up.
Good morning. It's Richard Gregory, member of council for the Alberta College of Social Workers. Just curious, if we are going to actually take that bottom level and move it up to the next level, as you were talking about, Celia, what would that mean in terms of minimum wage? How much would we have to bump up minimum wage to achieve that? And then where would that put Canada or Alberta in reference to minimum wage across Canada?
I might have to look at so my understanding was that the median wage or the median income of the second quintile is 40,000, is approximately 40,000. Here we go. 40,400. The median income of the poorest 20% is 14,200. Minimum wage, I believe, is at about 17,000. And LICO is at about 23,000. LICO would be about $13 an hour. So we're looking at a pretty significant boost in hourly wages. And we're looking at about a $30,000, $26,000 increase in yearly income. So again, significant, but approximately half the cost of the costs we tabulated. Yeah, and I mean, if we were investing in a poverty reduction strategy, we wouldn't necessarily see the benefits right away, and so we do need to think about it in long term. So it's not like saying, well, if we invest in prevention right now, we'll see the savings tomorrow, and so we need to think about it in terms of a 20-year period or a 30-year period and that kind of thing. But yeah, it is about a $26,000 discrepancy yearly in yearly income.
So we have time for one more question, and we do have a question here in Edmonton, so I'll just invite Bernadette up to the microphone.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I just wanted to, there's several things I wanted to talk about. Number one, when I talk about Aboriginal people, I talk about on reserve and off reserve. And I think what's happening, and I was talking with Laurie Hahn about, like the way that the money is being managed from the federal to the provincial. And one of the things that I come from a First Nation community where there's a housing crisis way up in Ottawa, Pisgat, James Bay, Ontario. And one of the things that when I was living up there that I had noticed is that the education part of learning about when you move to a city, what does that entail? And the INAC government has really, placed Aboriginal people in a place where there was no room to really learn about ownership of land, ownership of housing, ownership of education, any sort of ownership. So when you're leaving the community and you come to live in a city, many times you don't know that the whole budgeting and paying rent and paying hydro. I'm from Ontario, so utilities. So part of it for me is really about how do we get these two governments to be working together. and how do we create some of those teachings that needs to happen when you leave the First Nation community or even Métis community coming into the city. So that was one of the things that I wanted to comment on. Another thing I really like what Butch said about, you know, oftentimes I prefer looking at things as being success because, you know, from the time I was born, I was a deficit. And I kind of see, you know, that we're always talking about deficits and looking at successes. What does success look like? What does it mean, you know, when somebody has, you know, succeeded from the Skid Row to, you know, being able to become a manager or even just working a regular job? And oftentimes we don't look at that. We're always looking at deficits. And I think sometimes, you know, I see our communities, you know, being here in Edmonton alone, when people talk to me about First Nation people or Aboriginal people, there's a lot of success stories here, and we need to grasp those stories because oftentimes, you know, my granddaughter, she's only 11 years old, and all she hears about is deficits of Aboriginal people. And she looks at me, you know, and I tell her stories. There's a lot of success stories out there, so we need to capture those and bring them out. And I, you know, oftentimes, I mean, I look where, you know, a lot of our people come from and where they're at today, they're successful. And when you look at the population in Edmonton, and even Father Jim actually went to the city and talked to them about that, saying, we need to start, you know, putting people on a pedestal saying you've achieved something, you know, because we're always looking at the deficit. So for me, I just needed to talk about that. And when you look at the two systems that we have, the province and the federal, something needs to happen. It has been happening, but I think not enough. And oftentimes I talk about reinvesting in our families. And I think we you know, we're working towards that. So yeah, I want to share that. Hi.
Thank you, Bernadette. This is Bernadette Iatail. She's the Executive Director of Creating Hope Society, just so everyone knows. Did you have comments, Diana?
Well, I just want to thank you very much for that. And I think you're right. You know, achieving success being whatever that success is defined by that person. So achieving your own, the ability to achieve your own dreams, to achieve your own full potential. And whether that is in a First Nations context on reserve with traditional practices or in the marketplace, in a academic job, whatever that dream is. So I think you're right that being able to show success stories on both sides of that story is important.
Okay, thank you so much.